Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. This weekend's box office was very interesting. As I had said in a video that I had released last week, the Super Mario Bros. Movie has indeed surpassed the $1.3 billion threshold at the global box office, which I said would happen in a video that I had released last week, as the movie only needed to earn another $6 million to achieve that, and it did. And as I had also said in last week's video, this further cements the movie's position as the second highest grossing animated movie worldwide of all time, which is an amazing accomplishment. But what else occurred this weekend at the box office? Not surprisingly, SpiderMan Across the SpiderVerse opened in theaters and did very well domestically, earning $120.5 million. But it also earned around $88.1 million internationally for a global opening weekend of $208.6 million. Given that the animated movie has a production budget of $100 million, if we multiply that by 2.5 to estimate its break-even point, we get a value of $250 million to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. So just in its opening weekend, it earned 2.1 times its production budget, and it's therefore totally safe to say that Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is well on its way to breaking even and then some. But what about that undersea movie that opened last week? You know, the one starring Halle Bailey as a mermaid? Oh yes, that would be Disney's live-action remake of The Little Mermaid. This was its second weekend at the box office, and it somehow managed to earn $40.6 million domestically, which was a 58% drop from its domestic opening weekend, but slightly more than the predicted $37.6 million, as I had reported in a video that I had released the other night. Currently, the movie's domestic total is $186.2 million, which means that after 2 weekends in theaters, it still hasn't reached the $200 million mark yet domestically. But its international box office was a little more interesting because it reached $140.5 million for a combined global box office total of $326.7 million. Now, while that sounds impressive, there was also something a bit peculiar about the international box office figure, because up until yesterday, its total international box office was being reported as being $68.1 million. And in an article in Variety, it reported that the movie had earned $42 million internationally this weekend. So what this means is that $30 million that the movie had earned last week had somehow not been reported by multiple media sites. But I made the necessary adjustments in my box office tracking for the movie. At the present time, the movie's domestic share is now at 57%, which is slightly better than what I had reported in a video that I had released last weekend. But in a video that I had released the other night, I did make a couple of projections for the movie. One projection was based on the domestic share that had been reported last weekend, and the other was one that I had said would be a bit better at 60.78% in the event that the international box office performs better. And as it turns out, it had. And those two final global box office projections that I had calculated were as follows. The lower one was around $539 million, and the upper one was around $687 million. And both can be treated as a potential range, whose midpoint is around $613 million. After I updated the data I used in my projection calculations, using the updated international box office from last week and the reported second weekend box office data, I reran my projection, and here's what I got. The new final global box office projection for The Little Mermaid came out to around $612 million, with a weekly global box office drop of around 31.66%, beginning this weekend and then carried forward for the projection. Shockingly, that $612 million projection is nearly exactly the same as the $613 million midpoint between my previously calculated projected range. So over the coming weeks, as more box office data accumulates, I will further refine my projection calculations to see where they lead. But ultimately, what the newest projection implies is that in spite of last week's underreported international box office, it still appears that the movie's final box office will probably fall well below the movie's minimum break-even point of $780 million. And that $780 million break-even point comes from the fact that Disney spent around $250 million on the movie's production budget and another $140 million to market the movie. And since movie theaters keep around 50% of the gross ticket sales for themselves, you have to double that $390 million total cost to get the actual break-even point, which comes out to $780 million. So, The Little Mermaid is still not free from drowning into flopdom. But the final movie that I'll talk about in this video is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which came in 4th place in the domestic box office this weekend, and its global box office has now reached $780.1 million. So based on my previously estimated break-even point range for this movie of $625 million to $750 million, that I shared in previous videos and that are derived by multiplying its $250 million production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 has now more than likely broken even, which is a positive turnaround for Disney's MCU. And using 5 weeks of actual box office data, I am projecting that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 could end up earning around $870 million by the time its theatrical run ends, using an average week-to-week drop in global box office of 34.91%, which is based on all of the movie's previous weekly drops. And that projected $870 million, if that happens, is almost the same as the final global box office for its predecessor, 2017's Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which earned $869 million at the global box office. We'll have to wait and see how well Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 ends up doing, as well as whether The Little Mermaid's box office can find a life preserver or drown into obscurity in the coming weeks. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to see more of our videos in the future and help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.